The emergency lights cast everything in that sickly red glow that made even hardened Marines look like they'd been dipped in cherry syrup. Lieutenant Jake Morrison wiped plasma residue from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades, trying not to think about how close he'd come to becoming a very brief firework in the engine core of a Zelithian dreadnought. Morrison, General Patricia Hawk's voice cut through the post-battle chatter like a molecular blade through butter. My office, now. Jake groaned internally. The last time someone had summoned him with that particular tone, he'd ended up explaining why his controlled demolition of an enemy communications array had accidentally taken out half the station's plumbing system. In his defense, alien architecture was confusing, and who put water pipes next to quantum transmitters anyway? The command center still smelled like ozone and fierce sweat. Officers hunched over holographic displays, tracking the debris field that had once been the pride of the Zelithian advance fleet. Jake couldn't help but feel a tiny spark of pride. 3 enemy dreadnoughts reduced to scrap metal, and all it had cost humanity was his dignity, and probably a few years off his life from the radiation exposure. Congratulations, Lieutenant, General Hawk said, not looking up from her tactical display. Her gray hair was pulled back in its usual severe bun, though a few strands had escaped to frame her weathered face. Your little stunt with the thermal charges just saved approximately 12 million human lives. Just doing my job, General. Crawling through enemy ventilation shafts with enough explosives to level a city block is not typically considered. Just doing your job, Morrison. She finally looked at him, one eyebrow raised. Though I suppose for you it's Tuesday. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Actually, it's Thursday, ma'am. Smartass, but she was almost smiling, almost. Tell me, Lieutenant, are you familiar with the concept of spoils of war? You mean like keeping enemy weapons? Because I've been eyeing their plasma rifles. The targeting system alone. Not equipment, Morrison, prisoners. The word hung in the air like a bad smell. Jake had seen the detention bay on his way up from the lower decks. Rows of Zelithian warriors in energy restraints, their distinctive elongated ears twitching with what he assumed was either rage or the alien equivalent of a headache. They were tall, proud-looking creatures with skin that ranged from pale silver to deep bronze, and every single one of them looked like they'd rather eat his liver than accept his hospitality. There's an old military tradition, General Hawk continued, pulling up a holographic document that looked older than dirt and twice as boring. Dating back to when humans first started capturing enemies instead of just shooting them. A soldier who performs an act of exceptional valor in battle may claim one prisoner as personal property. Personal property. Jake's voice cracked slightly. Ma'am, I'm pretty sure that's called slavery, and last I checked, we decided that was a bad idea somewhere around the 21st century. Custody, Morrison, legal custody. They work for you, you're responsible for them, everybody wins. She paused. Well, everybody human wins. The jury's still out on the aliens. Jake stared at her. Are you offering me a pet Zelithian? I'm offering you a choice. Walk down to Detention Bay 3, pick whichever prisoner catches your fancy, and they're yours until this whole mess gets sorted out politically. She gestured vaguely at the star charts showing Zelithian territory. Could be weeks, could be months, maybe years if the diplomats get involved. What am I supposed to do with an alien prisoner? I can barely keep my own quarters clean. Figure it out. That's what separates the officers from the enlisted. General Hawk's expression grew serious. Look, Morrison, between you and me, command is under pressure to do something dramatic. The civilian authorities want a victory parade. The military wants intelligence. And the alien rights activists want us to treat our prisoners like honored guests. This way, everyone gets a little of what they want, and one lucky Zelithian gets to spend the war playing house with humanity's most accidentally successful demolitions expert. Jake opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The general had that look, the same one she'd worn when she'd assigned him to crawl through those engine cores. It was the look of someone who'd already made up her mind and was just waiting for you to catch up. Do I have to decide right now? The prisoners are being processed for transfer to the Titan penal colony tomorrow morning. So yes, unless you want to visit them in a maximum security facility on Jupiter's third moon. She stood up, smoothing down her uniform. Detention Bay 3, Morrison. Try not to pick the one that looks like they could bench press a shuttle. The walk to Detention Bay 3 gave Jake plenty of time to question his life choices. How had he gone from blowing up alien ships to shopping for alien roommates in the span of 4 hours? His mother had always said his life lacked direction, but this seemed excessive even for him. The detention bay was exactly as cheerful as expected. Rows of energy cells hummed with barely contained power, each one containing a Zelithian prisoner. Most of them were warriors, their muscular frames and battle scars telling stories of conflicts Jake couldn't even pronounce. They glared at him with eyes that ranged from amber to deep purple, their ears, longer and more pointed than any human's, twitching with what he was learning to recognize as aggressive body language. "Quite a collection," said Sergeant Martinez, the detention officer. She was a compact woman with the kind of smile that suggested she enjoyed her work a little too much. "We've got raiders, ship captains, a few engineers, and one communications officer who keeps trying to send messages by tapping on his cell wall in what I think is Morse code. Alien Morse code." Jake walked slowly down the rows, feeling increasingly ridiculous. What was he supposed to base this decision on? Combat ability, usefulness, whether they looked like they'd try to murder him in his sleep. Any of them speak human. Most of them have basic translation implants, standard military issue. Martinez consulted her tablet. "Though I should warn you, the translator software has some quirks. Yesterday one of them asked for water, and the system interpreted it as a request to consume liquid sadness. We're still working on the bugs." At the far end of the detention bay, almost hidden in the shadows between two larger cells, Jake noticed something that made him stop. A small figure sat hunched in the corner of her cell, knees drawn up to her chest. Unlike the warriors who postured and glared, she seemed to have folded in on herself, as if trying to disappear entirely. Her clothing was simple, a gray tunic and pants that looked more civilian than military. Her ears, while clearly Zelithian, seemed more delicate than the others, and her skin had an almost translucent quality in the harsh lighting. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. Something about her posture reminded Jake of his sister Emma, sitting in their father's old workshop after the news about the lunar colonies had come through. That same defeated stillness, that look of someone who'd lost everything and was still falling. "What's her story?" he asked, nodding toward the small figure. Martinez frowned, consulting her tablet again. "Honestly, we're not sure. She was found in the civilian quarters of the flagship, no weapons, no rank insignia. Claims to be a translator or something. Hasn't caused any trouble, barely speaks except to ask for water." She shrugged. "Honestly, I'd forgotten she was down here." Jake found himself walking closer to her cell. As he approached, she looked up for just a moment, and he caught a glimpse of her eyes, large, dark, and filled with a kind of exhausted wariness that hit him like a punch to the chest. "Her," he said quietly. "Sir." Martinez sounded genuinely confused. "I'll take her." "Morrison, are you sure? Because we've got some real prize specimens here. That one over there used to be a ship's captain, and that big guy in cell 12 apparently speaks 17 languages." Jake looked back at the small alien woman, who had returned her gaze to the floor. Something in his chest tightened, the same protective instinct that had made him volunteer for every dangerous mission since Emma died. "No," he said firmly. "Her, I'll take her." Martinez shrugged and made a note on her tablet. "Your funeral, Lieutenant. Literally, if she turns out to be some kind of assassin. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Sergeant." As the energy field around her cell deactivated, the alien woman looked up again, confusion clear in her dark eyes. Jake offered what he hoped was a reassuring smile, though given the circumstances, he probably just looked slightly deranged. "Hello," he said carefully. "I'm Jake Morrison. You're coming with me." She stared at him for a long moment, then spoke in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. The translator rendered her words in a flat, mechanical tone. "I do not understand." "That makes two of us," Jake admitted, "but we'll figure it out." Jake's quarters had never been designed for two occupants, especially when one of them was an alien who seemed determined to occupy as little space as humanly, or Zelithianly, possible. 3 days had passed since he'd made what everyone on Kepler Station was calling Morrison's Mercy mission, and the novelty was wearing off faster than his patience. "So, Lyra," Jake said, attempting conversation for the 14th time that morning while his coffee maker produced something that smelled like burned dreams. "Tell me about yourself, hobbies, interests, favorite ways to pass time that don't involve staring at the wall." The alien woman, who had finally offered the name Lyra after 2 days of uncomfortable silence, sat cross-legged on the small cushion he'd requisitioned from supply. She watched him with those large, dark eyes that seemed to catalog every movement he made, as if she expected him to suddenly sprout tentacles or start breathing fire. "I observe," she said quietly, the translator rendering her words in its typical monotone. The device had been acting up lately, occasionally turning serious statements into what sounded like bad poetry. Yesterday it had translated her request for water as "grant me liquid serenity," which had confused both of them. Observe what, exactly? Because unless you're writing a thesis on the mating habits of frustrated human soldiers, I'm not sure there's much to see in here. A flicker of something, confusion, amusement, crossed her face. The translator buzzed, then announced, "Your humor device requires maintenance." Jake nearly choked on his coffee. "My humor device." "The translator suggests you use humor to mask distress. This device appears broken." "Oh, that's not broken, that's just how I am." Jake grinned. "Fair warning, it gets worse under stress." The morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of awkwardness. Jake would wake up first, stumble to the hygiene unit while trying not to trip over the extra bedding he'd arranged on the floor. Lyra would wait until he finished, then spend exactly 12 minutes in the unit. He'd counted, emerging with her hair somehow perfectly arranged despite the complete lack of styling products designed for Zelithian physiology. "Lieutenant Morrison," came Corporal Jackson's voice over the comm, interrupting his contemplation of alien hair care routines. "General Hawk requests your presence in the briefing room. Oh, and she says to bring your, friend." Jake winced. The crew had taken to calling Lyra various names, ranging from Jake's project to the stray to his personal favorite, Lieutenant Morrison's conscience made manifest. The last one came from Dr. Vega in psychology, who apparently found their situation fascinating from an anthropological perspective. "Looks like we're wanted upstairs," Jake told Lyra, who immediately tensed. Over the past few days, he'd learned to recognize the signs, the way her ears flattened slightly against her head, how her hands would unconsciously flex as if reaching for weapons that weren't there. "Are we in danger?" she asked. "Probably not. Though with General Hawk, you never can tell. She once requisitioned a team of Marines to help her move furniture, and it turned out she was redecorating the detention center to improve prisoner morale." The prisoners were terrified. The walk to the briefing room attracted the usual stares and whispers. Jake had grown used to being the center of attention, usually because something had exploded unexpectedly. But this felt different. Lyra walked beside him with her head down, that same defeated posture she'd worn in the detention cell, and every curious glance felt like an invasion. "Morrison," Chief Petty Officer Santos called out from across the corridor. "How's domesticated life treating you? Your alien teaching you any cool tricks?" "She taught me 17 new ways to question my life choices," Jake called back. "Very educational." Lyra glanced at him. I have not instructed you in life choice evaluation. That's the joke, Lyra. I do not understand human humor. Join the club. I don't understand it either, and I've been practicing for 32 years. The briefing room was packed with more brass than Jake had seen since his court-martial for the unfortunate incident with the Admiral's shuttle. General Hawk sat at the head of the table, surrounded by intelligence officers, xenobiologists, and at least 3 people Jake didn't recognize, but who radiated the kind of authority that made him want to check if his shoes were tied properly. Ah, Morrison and our guest. General Hawk gestured to 2 empty chairs. Please sit. We have some interesting developments to discuss. The holographic display in the center of the table showed intercepted Zelithian communications, streams of data that looked like abstract art mixed with mathematical equations. Jake had seen similar displays before, usually right before someone told him to blow something up. Intelligence has been monitoring enemy communications since the battle, Colonel Martinez began. She was General Hawk's chief intelligence officer, a woman who could probably extract state secrets from a vending machine. We've noticed some unusual patterns. The display shifted to show message traffic patterns, spikes and valleys of data that painted a picture of organized chaos. Normally, after a defeat like this, we'd expect to see standard military communications. Status reports, casualty lists, requests for reinforcement. But, Jake prompted, knowing there was always a but in briefings like this. But instead, we're seeing massive search protocols. They're looking for someone or something. Colonel Martinez highlighted specific data streams. These aren't military channels. They're using diplomatic frequencies, royal communication networks, even civilian emergency broadcasts. Beside him, Jake felt Lyra go very still. Her breathing seemed to stop entirely, and when he glanced at her, her face had gone pale. Any idea what they're looking for? General Hawk asked. The translation algorithms are having trouble with the specifics, but we keep seeing references to something called the Lost Star and Blood of the Void Throne. Colonel Martinez shrugged. Could be religious terminology, could be code names. Alien mysticism isn't exactly my specialty. Jake noticed Lyra's hands had begun to tremble. Without thinking, he shifted slightly in his chair, positioning himself to block her from the direct view of most of the officers. Old habits from protecting Emma during their father's drinking binges. Create a barrier, draw attention away, make yourself the target instead. There's more, Dr. Yates from Xenobiology interjected. He was a thin man who always looked like he'd rather be examining specimens than sitting in briefings. We've analyzed the prisoner's stress responses since capture. Most show typical patterns for defeated combatants: resignation, anger, defiance. Standard stuff. The display changed to show biometric readings, heart rates, and neural activity patterns that looked like abstract art. But in the last 72 hours, something changed. Their stress levels have spiked dramatically. Whatever they're looking for, our prisoners know about it. Interesting. General Hawk's gaze swept the room, lingering on Lyra for a moment longer than necessary. Any thoughts on what might have triggered this change? Could be a rescue attempt in planning, Colonel Martinez suggested. Or maybe they've realized we've captured someone important. Jake felt Lyra's tension like a physical thing beside him. She was practically vibrating with suppressed something, fear, recognition. He had no idea, but every instinct told him she knew exactly what these communications were about. Sir, Jake said, raising his hand like he was back in basic training. Permission to speak freely. Always dangerous words from you, Morrison, but go ahead. Maybe we're overthinking this. I mean, they just lost 3 capital ships and their entire advance fleet. Maybe they're just, freaking out. I know I would be. A few chuckles around the room, but General Hawk wasn't smiling. Perhaps. But 30 years in intelligence has taught me that when aliens start acting unusual, it's usually because something we don't understand is happening. Or, Dr. Yates added cheerfully, they're planning something that will kill us all. In my experience, those are the two main categories of alien behavior. You're a real ray of sunshine, Doc, Jake muttered. The meeting continued for another hour, with various experts presenting theories that ranged from plausible to completely insane. Jake found his attention drifting to Lyra, who had barely moved since the intercepted communications were first mentioned. She stared at the holographic displays with an intensity that made him nervous. When they were finally dismissed, Jake waited until most of the officers had filed out before standing. Lyra rose beside him, still silent, still tense. "Lyra," he said quietly as they walked back toward his quarters. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She stopped walking entirely, turning to look at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets he couldn't even guess at. For a moment, he thought she might actually tell him what was wrong. Instead, she said, "Your people do not understand what they have intercepted." "Probably not. We're pretty good at blowing things up, but understanding alien mysticism isn't really our strong suit." "It is not mysticism." Something in her tone made Jake's blood run cold. "Then what is it?" Lyra looked around the corridor, checking to make sure they were alone. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It is a death warrant." The proximity alarm started screaming at 3:47 hours, which Jake considered personally offensive since he just managed to fall asleep after spending half the night wondering what Lyra had meant by death warrant. Nothing good ever happened when alarms went off in the middle of the night, a lesson he'd learned during the Great Cafeteria Fire of 2387, which technically hadn't been his fault but somehow ended up on his permanent record anyway. "All hands to stations," came General Hawk's voice over the comm, sounding annoyingly alert for someone who should have been asleep. "We have multiple contacts at the edge of the system. This is not a drill, people." Jake rolled out of his bunk, nearly tripping over Lyra, who was already sitting upright on her makeshift bed. In the dim emergency lighting, her eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly intensity that would have been beautiful if it weren't so terrifying. "Let me guess," Jake said, pulling on his uniform with practiced efficiency. "More of your people coming to finish what they started." "No," Lyra's voice was flat, emotionless. "They are not coming to finish anything. They are coming for me." Why would?" Jake stopped mid-sentence as her words from the previous day came flooding back. "Death warrant. Oh, that's not good." The tactical display in the command center looked like someone had dumped a bowl of angry fireflies into space. 16 Zelithian vessels had appeared at the edge of the system, arranged in a formation that screamed official business rather than surprise attack. Jake recognized the configuration from his strategic studies. It was diplomatic, but the kind of diplomacy that came with enough firepower to sterilize a planet. "Flagship is transmitting," Lieutenant Torres announced from the communication station. "They're requesting negotiations." General Hawk frowned. "Since when do the Zelithians negotiate?" "Last time they wanted to talk, it was to demand our unconditional surrender and the heads of our command staff on decorative spikes. Maybe they've developed a sense of humor," Jake suggested, earning him a withering look from the general. "Morrison, your optimism is touching but historically inaccurate." She turned to Colonel Martinez. "Analysis. 16 ships, including what looks like their flagship, Void's Promise. That's Admiral Vexter's personal command vessel." Colonel Martinez's face had gone pale. "Sir, Vexter doesn't negotiate. He conquered the Meridian colonies by sending the planetary government a fruit basket with a bomb in it." A fruit basket? Jake couldn't help himself. Apparently, it was a very nice fruit basket. Exotic species from across the galaxy, perfectly arranged. Colonel Martinez shrugged. The bomb was just a bonus. Beside Jake, Lyra had gone rigid. She whispered something in her own language, a word that sounded like breaking glass mixed with distant thunder. The translator remained mercifully silent. "You know this Admiral Vexter?" Jake asked quietly. "I know of him." Her voice was carefully controlled. "We do not speak names of the condemned in open space," Admiral Vexter replied smoothly. "But she will be known by the mark she bears, a scar upon the palm shaped like a star." Jake felt his blood turn to ice water. Slowly, he looked down at Lyra's hands, which were clenched into tight fists. As he watched, she seemed to realize what he was seeing and deliberately relaxed them, but not before he caught a glimpse of her left palm and the distinctive star-shaped scar that decorated it. "I need time to consult with my superiors," General Hawk said diplomatically. "Of course, you have 12 standard hours to consider our offer." Admiral Vexter's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I trust you will make the correct decision." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. "Well," General Hawk said finally, "that's new." "Sir," Colonel Martinez said urgently, 50 years of peace. The reparations alone could fund our defense budget for decades. This could change everything." "It could also be a trap," Dr. Yates pointed out helpfully. "In my experience, when aliens offer you everything you want, it's usually because they're planning to kill you in creative ways." "Your experience with aliens involves mostly dead specimens in jars," Lieutenant Torres observed. "Dead specimens don't lie." Jake found himself backing toward the exit, his mind racing. Lyra's hand, the scar, the way she'd reacted to the intercepted communications. Pieces of a puzzle were clicking together, forming a picture he really didn't want to see. "Morrison," General Hawk called out. "Where are you going?" "Just checking on my prisoner, sir, making sure she's secure." "Good idea. We'll need to examine all our Zelithian captives to see if any bear this mark." Jake nodded, trying to look casual while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Absolutely, sir. Very thorough. I'll start with mine." The walk back to his quarters felt like the longest journey of his life. Lyra walked beside him in silence, but he could feel her awareness like a physical thing. She knew that he knew. The question was what either of them was going to do about it. "So," Jake said as they entered his quarters and the door sealed behind them. "Star-shaped scar. That's quite a coincidence." Lyra sat heavily on her cushion, suddenly looking very small and very tired. "There are no coincidences in space, Jake Morrison, only choices and consequences." "Want to tell me about those consequences?" "Because from where I'm sitting, they look pretty terminal." For a long moment, she just stared at her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a kind of desperate resolve that made Jake's chest tighten. "My name is not Lyra," she said quietly. "It is Zaralyn, daughter of Emperor Korath, heir to the void throne of the Zelithian Empire." Jake stared at her. Then he started laughing, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. "Princess," he managed between chuckles that bordered on hysteria, "I accidentally adopted an alien princess. My mother is never going to believe this." "Jake, no, this is perfect. This is just perfect." He paced the small room like a caged animal. "I thought I was being compassionate. I thought I was saving some poor translator who'd gotten caught up in the war. Instead, I've kidnapped royalty." "Do you have any idea what the penalty is for kidnapping royalty? Because I'm pretty sure it involves being slowly fed to something with too many teeth." "I am not truly royalty anymore," Zaralyn said softly. "I am an exile. A fugitive. My uncle Drakmer murdered my father and took the throne. I escaped, but barely. And now Admiral Vexter wants you back." "No," her voice was sharp, certain. "Vexter does not serve my uncle. He was my father's most trusted general, and he loved my father like a brother. If he is here, it is because he knows the truth about my uncle's coup." Jake stopped pacing. "You're saying he wants to rescue you." "I am saying he wants to use me. A living heir gives legitimacy to any claim to the throne. With me, he could challenge my uncle's rule." She looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "But revolutions are bloody things, Jake Morrison, and they tend to consume those who start them. So what are our options here? Because from where I'm sitting, we have give you to your uncle who wants to kill you, or give you to the admiral who wants to use you to start a civil war. Neither of those sounds particularly appealing." Zaralyn smiled for the first time since he'd known her, a sad, resigned expression that somehow made her look both ancient and very young. "There is a third option. I'm listening. You could help me disappear." Jake stared at her. "You want me to help you escape from a space station while surrounded by 16 enemy warships? Yes, that's insane. Yes, it's impossible. Yes." Jake sat down heavily on his bunk, running his hands through his hair. "You know what? I've had worse plans." Jake's brilliant escape plan lasted exactly 17 minutes before it fell apart, which he considered a personal record for strategic thinking. The maintenance shaft he'd chosen as their route to the docking bay turned out to be occupied by Chief Engineer Wang, who was performing what he cheerfully called routine plasma conduit maintenance, and what Jake would later describe as trying to electrocute anyone stupid enough to crawl through the vents. "Morrison," Wang's voice echoed through the shaft as sparks showered down around them. "What are you doing in my conduits?" "Surprise inspection," Jake called back, trying to shield Zarelyn from the worst of the electrical discharge. "Just checking for, structural integrity, with a prisoner. She's my assistant, very qualified in alien architecture." There was a pause followed by the sound of Wang's laughter. "Morrison, you're an idiot. There's a perfectly good service corridor 10 meters to your left." The service corridor turned out to be not only more spacious, but also mercifully free of high-voltage electricity, which Jake considered a significant improvement. Zarelyn followed him through the maze of passages that honeycombed the station, her alien heritage apparently coming with an innate sense of direction that made Jake feel like a tourist in his own workplace. "The docking bay," she said quietly as they approached their destination. "This plan of yours, plan is a strong word. I prefer organized desperation. The shuttle you wish to steal, borrow, I prefer borrow, has a maximum range of 3.7 light-years. The nearest neutral system is 12 light-years away." Jake stopped walking. "You know, most people would have mentioned that detail during the planning phase. You did not ask. I also didn't ask if you could breathe oxygen, but I assumed that was implied by the fact that you're still alive." Zarelyn actually smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Your humor device is functioning better. Practice makes perfect." They reached the docking bay to find it buzzing with activity. Maintenance crews swarmed over various shuttles and fighters, preparing for what everyone assumed would be either a desperate last stand or a very one-sided negotiation. Jake spotted his target, a long-range reconnaissance shuttle that officially didn't have enough fuel to reach the edge of the system, but unofficially had enough black market modifications to outrun most pursuit vessels. "There," he pointed to the sleek craft, "the definitely not stolen, best name I could think of on short notice. You named a vessel you intend to steal definitely not stolen. Reverse psychology works every time." What happened next was either a stroke of genius or a complete disaster, depending on your perspective. As Jake and Zarelyn approached the shuttle, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lights bathed everything in that familiar red glow that meant either imminent death or someone had accidentally triggered the fire suppression system in the galley again. "All hands battle stations," came General Hawk's voice over the comm. "The Zelithian fleet is moving into attack formation. This is not a drill." Jake froze. "Attack formation? I thought they wanted to negotiate." Through the docking bay's massive viewports, they could see the enemy fleet repositioning itself, the elegant curves of Zelithian warships forming a pattern that spoke of imminent violence rather than diplomatic discourse. But something was wrong with the formation. Jake had studied enough tactical manuals to recognize when 16 ships weren't acting as a unified force. "They're fighting each other," Zarelyn breathed, pressing close to the viewport. She was right. What had looked like an attack formation was actually two separate groups of ships maneuvering against each other. Energy weapons flickered between the vessels like deadly fireworks, and even as they watched, one of the smaller ships broke apart in a brilliant explosion. "Civil war," Jake said quietly. "It's already started. Vexter must have made his move, Zaralyn confirmed. He probably brought ships loyal to my father, convinced them that I was alive and ready to reclaim the throne. But you're not ready to reclaim the throne. No, I am not. The battle above them intensified, turning the space around Kepler Station into a light show of destruction. Jake found himself mesmerized by the deadly ballet of warships, each vessel a work of art that happened to be trying to kill the others. You know, he said conversationally, this puts a whole new spin on our escape plan. How so? Well, originally we were going to sneak away while everyone was distracted by negotiations. Now we're going to sneak away while everyone is distracted by a space battle. It's like an upgrade. Zaralyn stared at him. You find this amusing. I find everything amusing when the alternative is complete terror. It's a coping mechanism. Your coping mechanisms are bizarre. You should see my stress-eating habits. I once consumed an entire month's supply of emergency rations during a particularly difficult exam. The docking bay shuddered as something large exploded uncomfortably close to the station. Through the chaos, Jake could see personnel running to battle stations, manning defensive turrets, and preparing for the possibility that the Zelithian Civil War might spill over onto human territory. This is our chance, he said, grabbing Zaralyn's hand. While everyone's busy watching the fireworks, they made it halfway to the shuttle before General Hawk's voice cut through the din of alarms and running footsteps. Going somewhere, Lieutenant. Jake turned to find the general standing behind them, flanked by two Marines whose expressions suggested they were prepared for trouble. Hawk herself looked more curious than angry, which somehow made the situation worse. General, Jake said, attempting his most innocent smile. Just performing a routine inspection of Morrison. I've known you for 6 years. In that time, you've blown up 3 enemy installations, 2 of our own defensive turrets by accident, and somehow managed to set fire to a vacuum-sealed storage bay. What you've never done is routine inspections. Jake sighed. Fair point. Besides, General Hawk continued, her gaze shifting to Zaralyn, I think it's time our guest and I had a conversation. A real conversation. The general's office had been modified with additional security measures since the last time Jake had been there, which probably said something unflattering about his track record with authority figures. Zaralyn sat in the chair across from General Hawk's desk, her posture regal despite her simple clothing and current status as a prisoner of war. Your Highness, General Hawk said without preamble, because that's what you are, isn't it? Zaralyn inclined her head slightly. Now I am simply Zaralyn. Modest, I like that in royalty, makes a refreshing change. The general leaned back in her chair. Admiral Vexter has been sending increasingly urgent messages. Apparently, his fleet's current disagreement with itself has something to do with a missing princess who may or may not be aboard this station. His fleet is divided, Zaralyn said quietly. Some ships remain loyal to my uncle's regime. Others remember their oaths to my father. And you're the key to resolving this conflict. I am the key to starting a war that will consume both our peoples. General Hawk studied her for a long moment. You know what I find interesting, Your Highness? In all the intelligence reports about Zelithian royalty, there's never been any mention of a crown princess who speaks perfect standard, understands human tactical doctrine, and seems to know more about interspecies relations than most of our diplomats. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. General, Princess Zaralyn wasn't just hiding from her uncle's coup, General Hawk continued. She was hiding here in human space for years before the war started. Working as a translator, building contacts, learning our weaknesses and strengths. You think she's a spy, Jake said flatly. I think she's been preparing for exactly this situation. General Hawk's smile held no warmth. The question is, preparing for what? Zaralyn met the general's gaze steadily. I have been preparing for peace. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Outside, the space battle continued to rage, distant explosions providing a percussion soundtrack to the conversation. Peace, General Hawk repeated. My father believed that our species would eventually destroy each other if we continued on our current path. The Zelithian Empire grows through conquest, but humanity refuses to be conquered. An unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. So he sent you to live among us. He sent me to understand you, to find a way for our peoples to coexist without mutual annihilation. Zaralin's voice grew stronger, more certain. The war began because my uncle believes only in strength. He sees your resistance as a challenge to be crushed rather than a strength to be respected. Jake found himself staring at her. You've been playing a long game. I have been trying to save both our species from their own stupidity. General Hawk stood and walked to the viewport, watching the battle rage above them. And how's that working out for you, Princess? Better than expected, actually. Zaralin rose as well, moving to stand beside the general. Admiral Vexter's presence here proves that there are still those in the Imperial fleet who remember my father's vision. The fact that his fleet is fighting itself proves that the Empire is not as unified as my uncle believes. And Lieutenant Morrison's role in all this. Jake blinked. I have a role. You chose compassion over strength, Zaralin said, turning to look at him. In a detention bay full of warriors and officers, you chose the one person who appeared weakest. You offered protection without expecting anything in return. You treated a prisoner as a person rather than a resource. I just didn't want to see anyone get hurt. Exactly. She smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached her eyes. You proved that humans are capable of the kind of thinking that makes peace possible. General Hawk snorted. Morrison as a symbol of human compassion. The universe has a sense of humor. Hey, Jake protested. I can be compassionate. I'm very compassionate. I once shared my lunch with a stray maintenance droid. The droid was malfunctioning and trying to eat garbage. Still counts. The intercom crackled to life. General Hawk to the command center. Admiral Vexter is requesting immediate communication. The command center's main screen showed the Zelithian flagship, now heavily damaged but still imposing. Admiral Vexter appeared tired but determined, his ornate uniform scorched and his bearing slightly less regal than before. General Hawk, he said without preamble, I must speak with the heir. The heir. Do not insult my intelligence. Princess Zaralin is aboard your station. I can feel her presence in the Force. The translator hiccuped. I can sense her presence in the cosmic currents of destiny. Your translator needs work, Jake observed. Zaralin stepped forward, moving into the viewscreen's range. Hello, Uncle Vex. Admiral Vexter's stern expression cracked, revealing something almost like relief. Little star, you live. I live, though I am no longer the child you remember. No, you have grown wise as your father predicted. Vexter glanced around the human command center, his gaze lingering on Jake. And you have found interesting allies. The humans are not our enemies, Uncle. They are potential partners if we choose to see them as such. Your Uncle Drakmer sees them as obstacles to be removed. Then my Uncle Drakmer is a fool. The conversation continued, switching between standard and rapid Zelithian that the translator couldn't keep up with. Jake found himself watching the interplay between Princess and Admiral, seeing the careful dance of politics and genuine affection that characterized their relationship. Finally, Admiral Vexter spoke in standard again. I have an offer for all parties. General Hawk stepped forward. We're listening. The ships loyal to the true throne will withdraw from human space immediately. In return, Princess Zaralin will return with us to formally claim her birthright and end this usurper's reign. And if she refuses, General Hawk asked, then she remains with you, and the civil war continues until one side destroys the other. Vexter's expression was grim. But without the rightful heir, the empire will eventually fragment entirely. There will be no central authority to negotiate with, no way to ensure lasting peace between our peoples. Jake looked at Zaralin, seeing the weight of impossible choices in her eyes. So you're saying she has to choose between her freedom and galactic peace? I am saying she must choose between personal desires and responsibility. That's a terrible choice. Most important choices are terrible, Admiral Vexter replied. That is what makes them important. Zarelyn was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical display that showed the ongoing battle. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and certain. I will return, she said, but with conditions. Name them. First, any humans who wish to accompany me as cultural advisors will be granted safe passage and honored positions in the new government. Jake felt something warm and terrifying unfold in his chest. Zarelyn. Second, she continued, ignoring his interruption, Lieutenant Jake Morrison will serve as my personal liaison to humanity, with full diplomatic immunity and the authority to negotiate on behalf of both species. What? Jake's voice cracked. I don't know anything about diplomacy. You know about compassion, Zarelyn said simply. Everything else can be learned. Admiral Vexter nodded slowly. Acceptable. Your father would be proud, little star. General Hawk was grinning. Well, Morrison, looks like you're getting a promotion. Try not to blow anything up. I make no promises. 3 months later, Jake stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, watching twin suns set over the crystal spires of the Zelithian capital. He wore the formal robes of a human ambassador, which felt about as natural as wearing a suit made of live eels. But Zarelyn, now Empress Zarelyn I, had insisted that proper attire was important for diplomatic functions. The trade agreements are proceeding smoothly, she reported, joining him at the railing. Her own robes were magnificent, all flowing fabric and embedded gems that caught the light like captured stars, but she wore them with the same quiet dignity she'd shown in his cramped quarters aboard Kepler Station. Good, Jake said, though I still think teaching humans how to brew that fermented fruit drink of yours is going to cause more problems than it solves. Your people seem to enjoy it. That's the problem. Last week, Admiral Chen tried to negotiate a military alliance while completely drunk on the stuff. He offered to trade Earth's moon for 3 cases of the vintage variety. Zarelyn laughed, a sound that still surprised him with its warmth. Did you accept the offer? I told him he'd have to discuss it with the lunar colonies first. They're still not speaking to him. The Civil War had ended faster than anyone expected once Zarelyn had returned to claim her throne. Her uncle's support had crumbled when faced with the legitimate heir backed by the Imperial fleet's most respected admiral. The transition of power had been surprisingly bloodless, though Jake suspected that had more to do with Vexter's reputation for creative violence than any sudden outbreak of reasonableness among Zelithian nobles. Any word from General Hawk? Zarelyn asked. She says the new defense treaties are working better than expected. Apparently, having Zelithian technical advisors has improved our weapons efficiency by 30%. Jake grinned. She also says she misses having someone around to blame explosions on. And you? Do you miss your old life? Jake considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, he'd been a demolitions expert with a talent for accidental destruction and a tendency to make jokes at inappropriate moments. Now he was humanity's primary representative to an alien empire, responsible for maintaining peace between species that had been trying to kill each other for decades. You know what's funny? He said finally. I thought being a soldier meant protecting people by blowing things up. Turns out, being a diplomat means protecting people by making sure things don't get blown up in the first place. A profound realization. Don't sound so surprised, I have profound moments. Very rarely. Hey, Jake paused, looking at her more closely. Are you happy, Zarelyn? Really happy?